Over time, something subtle but significant began to happen. The coverage shifted, not just in volume, but in tone. Less curiosity, more fatigue, less nuance, more dismissal. She became, to some, a symbol of controversy rather than a person navigating it. And symbols don't get sympathy. They get simplified. But simplification erases complexity. And complexity is where warning signs live. Because when pressure builds without release, the body responds, whether the world believes it or not. Stress isn't an opinion. Anxiety isn't a narrative. Fatigue isn't a debate topic. They exist whether they're acknowledged or not. And when you combine that with relentless visibility, the stakes rise quietly. Security concerns, public movements, crowds, vehicles, all the mundane logistics of daily life become charged. A drive isn't just a drive. It's a route, a risk assessment, a potential incident. And here's something few people consider. For public figures under intense scrutiny, the most dangerous moments aren't on stage. They're in transit, between places, between protections, between attention and anonymity. That's where unpredictability lives. And unpredictability doesn't announce itself. It just happens, which is why the mention of a car crash, however limited the details, landed so heavily. Because it wasn't just an accident in isolation. It was an interruption in a life already under strain. Now let's talk about emotional exhaustion. Not burnout, not collapse, the quieter kind. The kind that shows up as hypervigilance, as tension that never quite releases, as the sense that something could go wrong at any moment, because history suggests it might. When you live like that long enough, your nervous system doesn't relax. It waits. And waiting changes how you move through the world. It sharpens awareness. It increases sensitivity. It amplifies fear. Not fear of criticism. Fear of consequence. And that's where this story deepens. Because for Meghan, fear wasn't abstract. It had precedent. Public backlash. Hostile commentary. Security debates played out in headlines rather than handled quietly. Every discussion about her safety became politicized, which meant safety itself became controversial. Imagine realizing that even your protection is a topic people argue about, that your well-being is weighed against public opinion. That doesn't make you feel safe. It makes you feel exposed. And exposure is exhausting. Now combine that exhaustion with something sudden, an unexpected moment, a disruption, a loss of control. That's how pressure reveals itself. Not gradually, but abruptly. People often ask why certain incidents hit harder than others. Why one moment becomes a turning point. The answer is almost never the moment itself. It's everything that came before it. Every held breath. Every dismissed concern. Every night spent scrolling past headlines written about you. So when reports of a car crash began circulating, the reaction wasn't just about impact or injury. It was about vulnerability becoming visible. For years, vulnerability had been denied, debated, or reframed as weakness. But an accident doesn't care about narratives. It doesn't ask permission. It cuts through illusion. And suddenly, the conversation changed. Because no matter how divided opinions were, everyone understands one thing. Accidents are real. They don't take sides. They don't care who you are. Which forces a recalibration. Even critics paused. Even skeptics softened their language. Not because opinions vanished, but because humanity reasserted itself. And that's telling. Because it suggests the pressure had reached a point where even a single incident felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the system surrounding her life was strained. Confirmation that something was unsustainable. Confirmation that the margin for error had shrunk dangerously small. Now here's where the palace announcement connects directly to this buildup. Institutions don't react to one-off events in isolation. They react to patterns. And the pattern surrounding Meghan Markle had been one of prolonged tension, unresolved conflict, and escalating scrutiny. The crash didn't create that. It exposed it, which explains the tone of the statement. Sadness, concern, careful wording. Those aren't reactions to a minor inconvenience. They're reactions to accumulated risk. And when risk accumulates, even small triggers demand response. Let's slow down again. Imagine being someone responsible for anticipating worst-case scenarios. Your job isn't optimism. It's prevention. You don't wait for disaster. You respond to proximity. And proximity was suddenly too close for comfort. That's why this moment mattered. Not because it confirmed tragedy, but because it flirted with it. And flirting with disaster is often enough to force change. So when people ask why this story feels heavier than others, why it lingers longer, why it unsettles even those tired of royal drama, this is why. It sits at the intersection of pressure and chance, of exhaustion and unpredictability, of a person stretched thin in a moment that tested that tension. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't know how many close calls never became headlines, how many moments passed quietly, how many risks were navigated successfully, but we know this one surfaced. And when something surfaces, it's usually because it can't stay buried anymore. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because the crash itself, whatever its specifics, was only the spark. What followed was confusion, contradiction, a scramble for narrative control. And that's where things started to unravel. Because once pressure meets public uncertainty, chaos fills the gap. And the hours after the incident would prove just how quickly clarity can disappear, especially when too many voices speak at once. But before we get there, understand this clearly. The palace didn't respond because Meghan Markle is controversial. They responded because the pressure around her life had reached a point where another incident, any incident, could no longer be treated as routine. And that realization changed everything. Because once an institution acknowledges vulnerability, it can't pretend it doesn't exist. And once vulnerability becomes public, nothing goes back to the way it was. But what happened in the immediate aftermath, the conflicting accounts, the silence, the sudden shifts in tone, would only deepen the mystery. And as details began to clash, so did trust. But what came next would introduce confusion on a scale no one was prepared for. The hours following the incident were surreal. Reports began trickling in, each one slightly different from the last. Some said the vehicle had swerved to avoid an obstacle. Others suggested brake failure. A few unnamed sources hinted at a more alarming scenario, one that left editors hesitating to print. This is the point where confusion multiplies. Once speculation enters the picture, it doesn't stay neat. Each retelling adds a layer. Each assumption feels like fact. And by the time the public sees the story, it's almost unrecognizable from the original event. Imagine being Meghan at that moment. Every detail dissected, every action interpreted, every misstep amplified. Privacy evaporates. Even security measures, which should feel protective, start feeling like a spotlight. You can't just be. You must perform safety, caution, awareness, constantly. One momentary lapse, and the world is watching. Meanwhile, social media exploded. Fans and critics alike flooded timelines with questions and conjecture. Screenshots of the palace statement circulated with captions like, "What does this mean?" Or "Is she okay?" Threads of speculation wound across platforms, looping back on themselves, creating a frenzy where clarity was nearly impossible. Yet amidst the digital chaos, the palace remained measured. Silence where sensationalism screamed. Carefully chosen words where most would have shouted. They knew that responding hastily would risk inflaming the situation, giving life to narratives that weren't verified. Their restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. But strategy can only do so much when information is leaking from multiple sources. Journalists were calling multiple contacts. Former staff were being asked to comment. Royal insiders were double-checking facts, unsure which details were confirmed and which were rumor. Then came the contradictions. Initial reports suggested minor injuries. Other reports hinted at hospital visits. Some unnamed sources claimed no one was hurt at all. Some even implied the car had been moving unusually fast, though the official word never confirmed it. Every version of the story existed simultaneously. None could be verified immediately. This contradiction created tension, not just in the media, but in the public consciousness. People couldn't process certainty because certainty didn't exist. And uncertainty is far more compelling than clarity. It pulls you in, keeps you scrolling, keeps you checking updates, keeps you invested emotionally. Meanwhile, internal pressure within the palace increased. Advisors debated whether to release more information or stay silent. Legal teams reviewed the potential fallout of any statement. Family members worried about how the story would affect public perception. The slightest misstep could escalate the situation, and escalate fast. Public sentiment began shifting subtly. Where skepticism once dominated, empathy began creeping in. Not everyone, But enough people paused long enough to consider her humanity rather than the narrative. That pause was critical. It reminded the institution that perception could pivot in moments, and that even critics could be swayed by authentic vulnerability. At the same time, Meghan's personal response became a subject of intense scrutiny. Sources suggested she was calm outwardly, but reports hinted at exhaustion and emotional strain behind the scenes. Imagine carrying the weight of constant observation, combined with real risk, and then being expected to maintain composure for the world to witness. It's a surreal kind of pressure few can understand. This is the point where the story's layers start to intersect. The media frenzy, the palace's cautious language, the accumulation of personal stress, and the public's sudden emotional engagement. Each element feeds the other. Each one amplifies tension, and no single element can be fully resolved in isolation. Then came the subtle but important signals. First, the palace didn't offer any casual reassurances. No mention of routine, no attempt to normalize the event. That absence spoke louder than any statement could. Next, there was a noticeable restraint in the coverage of injuries or causes, suggesting either ongoing investigations or deliberate narrative management. And finally, the timing of the release, late at night, strategically placed, indicated they wanted to control initial perceptions before social media could spin out of control. All of this pointed to a clear conclusion. The incident, however minor in physical impact, had crossed into a domain where perception, emotion, and institutional responsibility collided. And yet, there was another layer few considered at the time. This wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the system surrounding her. Security protocols, advisors, communication strategies, and family oversight. All of it had been stress-tested. And this event highlighted vulnerabilities in that system. Minor cracks suddenly became glaringly visible. Consider this. In any high-stakes environment, accidents or incidents are rarely isolated. They reveal the weaknesses, the friction points, and the pressure seams. What seemed like a single moment, a car, a minor crash, a statement, actually illuminated months, perhaps years, of unresolved tension. At this point, the stakes escalated in another dimension: public trust. The palace relies heavily on perception. The public's belief in competence, care, and control is foundational. When an incident surfaces and uncertainty dominates, that trust is fragile. Any misstep in communication, any contradictory report, any delayed response, all of it becomes a potential crisis multiplier. The hours after the crash were thus a high-wire act. Communicators, advisors, and family members all navigated between revealing enough to acknowledge concern while withholding enough to prevent panic. It's a delicate balance, almost impossible to maintain perfectly. And the tension of managing that balance is invisible to the outside world, but very real to those inside. Meanwhile, the media narrative evolved in unpredictable ways. Social media posts hinted at danger. News outlets analyzed minor discrepancies as if they were clues to a larger mystery. Every unconfirmed report became evidence in a virtual courtroom of opinion. And the public, unable to access verified details, became complicit in spreading speculation. At the heart of this whirlwind, Meghan's personal experience remained private. Observers can piece together bits of information, but the human reality, fear, confusion, fatigue, relief, remained largely unseen. And that disparity between perception and reality is a recurring theme in crises involving public figures. What everyone sees is not what's lived. Yet even with the chaos, something remarkable happened. Public empathy surged in ways that hadn't been fully predicted. Discussions shifted from criticism to concern. People speculated less about motives and more about outcomes. That subtle shift changed the emotional environment surrounding the incident. And the palace, acutely aware of this, had to weigh its next steps carefully. Each decision carried consequences, both public and private. A statement too strong could alarm unnecessarily. A statement too weak could seem indifferent. And timing mattered as much as tone. As night turned into early morning, the first ripple of clarity began to emerge. Journalists confirmed minor injuries. The car had been moving cautiously, but conditions were challenging. There were no life-threatening consequences. And yet, despite these reassurances, tension lingered. Not all questions had answers, and not all fears had been addressed. Which is why the story didn't end there. Because the crash, minor or not, had exposed the fragile ecosystem around Meghan Markle. Media pressure, family oversight, public perception, and personal vulnerability. That ecosystem would have to adapt quickly to prevent future crises. And that adaptation would not be easy. Because once a system has shown its weak points, nothing stays the same. Every protocol is reassessed. Every communication scrutinized. Every decision analyzed for potential fallout. And in high-pressure environments like this, those changes ripple far beyond the initial incident. So what started as a single event, a car crash, had transformed into a multi-layered crisis, one of public perception, institutional responsibility, media frenzy, and personal strain. The implications were far-reaching, and the full impact was only beginning to be understood. And just when it seemed the situation might stabilize, a new development arrived. Details emerged suggesting that what had seemed like an isolated incident might, in fact, be linked to broader concerns. Patterns in scheduling, security lapses, and a strain on resources that had been building for months. And that's where the narrative truly thickens. Because the hours following the incident revealed not just what happened, but what was possible. The near misses, the quiet risks, the moments of luck or timing that kept disaster at bay. And those moments matter more than most people realize. They shape responses. They shape perceptions. They shape decisions that can have lasting impact. And the next chapter of this story will reveal just how delicate that balance became, how quickly routine can become crisis, and how human lives, public roles, and institutional pressures collide in ways no one expects. The media landscape had already shifted by the time the next morning rolled around. Newsrooms that had initially approached the story cautiously were now awash with speculation, tweets, and conflicting eyewitness accounts. Headlines multiplied, some subtle, some sensational, all vying for attention in the same 24-hour window. In this environment, clarity is almost impossible. Confusion becomes currency. The more uncertainty, the more clicks, the more debate. And yet, amidst the cacophony, the palace maintained its calm. No press conference, no live statement, just the quiet, measured acknowledgement from the night before. For those paying attention, it was clear this was deliberate. In an age of instant reaction, restraint is a form of control. But control has limits. Because once details begin to leak, even inadvertently, a narrative begins to form outside the institution's influence. By mid-morning, multiple journalists were reporting inconsistencies. One source suggested minor damage to the vehicle, while another claimed the car had come to a complete stop before a small collision occurred. Anonymous tips circulated about police involvement, medical checkups, and whether safety protocols had been fully adhered to. No one could confirm everything. And in that vacuum, speculation fills every gap. For Meghan, the pressure was compounded. Not only had she endured years of relentless scrutiny, but now even mundane activities were potentially headline-making moments. A drive to an appointment or a routine errand was no longer routine. Every movement was a story, every glance a commentary, every pause an opportunity for speculation. Let's pause and consider the human dimension for a moment. Imagine living in a world where the smallest incident could be dissected, replayed, and debated endlessly. Where fatigue and emotional strain become background noise in the face of public curiosity. Where privacy is not a right, but a fleeting luxury. And where, even in moments of calm, tension lurks beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest spark. This is the reality Meghan had been navigating for years. And in this case, the spark was literal and figurative. Reports continued to diverge. Some claimed a minor collision. Others hinted at a sudden maneuver to avoid a hazard. Witnesses disagreed. Security teams were reported to have acted swiftly, yet some accounts suggested delayed responses. Each fragment of information pulled the story in a slightly different direction. And as these fragments accumulated, the narrative began to take on a life of its own, separate from the facts, shaped by perception, fear, and interpretation. Meanwhile, the public reaction evolved. Initially, curiosity and concern dominated, but soon emotions intensified. Social media threads became spaces for debate and conjecture. Questions emerged. Was Meghan physically harmed? How could such an incident occur under strict security protocols? And, most pressingly, what did this mean for her well-being in the long term? The palace, acutely aware of the stakes, remained deliberate in its messaging. Each statement, or lack thereof, was weighed against potential outcomes. Overreaction could alarm the public. Underreaction could erode trust. Timing, tone, and phrasing were all critical, calculated down to the word. The announcement didn't come with sirens. It didn't come with flashing red banners or a breaking news chime. It came quietly, too quietly. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. A short statement, carefully worded, released at a time when most of the world was distracted, scrolling, half listening, assuming it was just another royal update that could wait until morning. But here's the question you need to sit with right now. Why would Kensington Palace, an institution trained for restraint, delay, and silence, choose this moment to speak? And why did so many people feel a knot in their stomach the instant they read Meghan Markle's name? Because something about this felt different, heavier, sharper, as if the words on the screen were carrying more than they were willing to admit. Let me ask you something. Have you ever read a statement and felt like it was hiding a heartbeat? That's what this was. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably urgent. Within minutes, social media began to stir. Screenshots, reposts, whispers, people rereading the same lines again and again, searching for meaning between the commas. Newsrooms hesitated. Commentators paused mid-sentence. Even critics, especially critics, slowed down. Because the announcement didn't just acknowledge sadness. It signaled concern. And when the palace signals concern, history tells us one thing very clearly. Something has already gone wrong. Now pause for a second and think about timing. Why now? Why release anything at all when silence has so often been their shield? For years, Meghan Markle has existed in a strange space, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Talked about endlessly, yet officially addressed as little as possible. Praised, criticized, defended, attacked, sometimes all in the same headline. And yet, when real crises have emerged in the past, the palace often waited. Days, weeks, sometimes longer. But this time, they didn't. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if this announcement wasn't about controlling the story, but about responding to something they couldn't ignore? Here's where the tension really begins. Because as the palace statement circulated, another phrase began trending alongside it. Car crash. 2 words. Heavy words. Words that carry echoes whether we want them to or not. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about Meghan Markle as a public figure. It wasn't about royal drama or media narratives or who was right or wrong. It became about vulnerability, risk, mortality. People started asking questions out loud that they usually keep buried. Was she safe? What actually happened? Why did details feel scarce? And why did this trigger such a fast response? You could feel the collective unease spreading. Because when something serious happens to someone who lives under constant surveillance, silence becomes suspicious. And when an institution known for silence chooses to speak, even briefly, people listen differently. Now let's rewind for a moment. Before the announcement, before the headlines, before the speculation, go back to the atmosphere surrounding Meghan Markle in recent months. Public fatigue, renewed criticism, sympathy cycles rising and falling, a constant tug-of-war between narrative and reality. She had become, once again, a symbol people projected onto. Strength to some, controversy to others. A reminder of old wounds for the monarchy. A lightning rod for opinions that rarely pause to consider the human cost. And then, abruptly, the tone shifted. Not because someone wanted it to, but because something forced it to. Think about how rare that is. In a media ecosystem designed to manufacture outrage, genuine concern cuts through like a cold wind. You feel it immediately. Your posture changes. Your scrolling slows. Your assumptions soften. That's what happened here. People didn't argue first. They worried. And that alone tells us this story sits in a different category. Let's talk about that car crash reference, carefully. Because what makes this moment so unsettling isn't just the idea of an accident. It's the lack of clarity, the gaps, the spaces where information should be. No dramatic footage flooding timelines. No instant press conference. No confident voice explaining everything away. Just fragments. And fragments are dangerous. Fragments invite memory. Fragments invite comparison. Fragments invite fear. Especially when history has taught the world that not all royal car stories end neatly. You could feel that shadow without anyone saying it out loud. Even journalists seemed hesitant, choosing words with unusual caution. Phrases like reports suggest and details remain limited, repeated over and over. Analysts speculated not on facts, but on tone. Why does this feel so serious? Why does this feel so restrained? Why does this feel like something everyone is afraid to say too much about? And that brings us back to Kensington Palace, an institution that understands optics better than almost anyone alive. They know when to wait. They know when to speak. And most importantly, they know when silence would cause more damage than words. So if they spoke, even briefly, what calculation had already been made? Here's another question worth asking. Who was this announcement really for? The public? The press? Or someone closer? Sometimes statements aren't designed to inform. They're designed to acknowledge, to signal awareness, to show that something is being taken seriously behind closed doors, even if the details remain sealed. And if that's the case, then this announcement wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the confirmation that the story was already in motion. Let's slow the pace for a moment. Imagine being inside those palace walls when the decision was made. Phones ringing. Advisors weighing every word. Legal teams scanning for risk. Public relations specialists debating timing down to the minute. Because once a statement is released, you can't pull it back. And yet, they went ahead. Which suggests pressure. Internal pressure. Emotional pressure. A sense that waiting would be worse than speaking. That alone tells us this situation wasn't routine. And then there's Meghan herself. So often discussed as an idea rather than a person. A headline rather than a human being. A narrative rather than a nervous system under strain. Strip all the politics away for a moment and ask yourself something simple. What does it feel like to live knowing that if something goes wrong, even briefly, the entire world will speculate before you can catch your breath? That every incident becomes symbolic. That every silence becomes suspicious. That even sadness becomes a public event. Now add the weight of a car crash, no matter the severity. And tell me that doesn't change everything emotionally. Because accidents do that. They shatter the illusion of control. They remind everyone involved how thin the line really is. And suddenly, the debates fade. The snark pauses. The certainty dissolves. All that remains is a shared, uncomfortable awareness. This could have been worse. And maybe, just maybe, it almost was. That's the thought no one wanted to voice. But everyone felt it. Which explains the tone shift. The hesitation. The quiet concern. And the reason this story matters right now, not because it feeds drama, but because it exposes something raw beneath the spectacle. The cost of constant attention, the price of being perpetually watched, the fragility that fame pretends doesn't exist. Kensington Palace didn't just announce sadness. They acknowledged vulnerability. And that's rare. But here's the part that hasn't fully surfaced yet. The announcement wasn't the first sign that something was wrong. It was the first sign that something could no longer be contained. Because before the palace spoke, before the headlines settled, before the world began asking careful questions, something happened that set all of this in motion. Something quiet, something fast, something that would force everyone, from the press to the palace, to confront a reality they've avoided for years. And once you understand what came before the statement, you'll realize the announcement wasn't the shock. It was the warning. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Introduction section complete. Go. The statement landed like a cold hand on the back of the neck. Not dramatic. Not long. Not emotional in the way people expect emotion to look. But there it was. And if you followed the royal family long enough, you know this truth. The calmer the language, the more serious the situation usually is. Here's the shocking part. Kensington Palace almost never speaks unless it has to. So why did they speak now? Why did they choose these words, this timing, this tone? And why did seasoned royal watchers, people who have seen scandals, abdications, divorces, and disasters, all react the same way, with unease? Because this announcement didn't read like damage control. It read like containment. Let's break it down from the very beginning. When the palace released the statement, it didn't lead with reassurance. That alone was unusual. Historically, royal communications are designed to calm the public first and clarify later. This one did the opposite. It acknowledged sadness before safety. Think about that. If everything were fully resolved, if the situation were minor, the order would have been reversed. Safety first, calm second, context last. But instead, the emotional note came first. That's not accidental. Every word in a palace statement is debated, edited, and weighed. Nothing slips through casually, which means someone insisted that the emotional gravity be acknowledged immediately. And that tells us something critical. This wasn't just about facts. It was about impact. Almost immediately, analysts began dissecting the phrasing. Why concern instead of awareness? Why avoid specifics? Why reference timing without detailing events? Because specifics lock you in. And when an institution avoids specifics, it's often because the full picture is still moving. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever noticed how institutions behave when they don't yet know how bad something is? They hedge. They soften. They leave doors open. That's exactly what this statement did. It wasn't an explanation. It was a marker, a signal to the world that something significant had occurred, significant enough that silence was no longer an option, but unresolved enough that clarity would have to wait. And waiting, in the modern media environment, is dangerous. Because the moment the statement went live, something else happened. People began comparing, not out loud at first, quietly, internally. They compared the tone to past announcements. They compared the silence to other crises. They compared the words chosen to moments when the palace had been caught off guard before. And the conclusion many reached was unsettling. This felt rushed. Not sloppy, but urgent. Urgency inside the palace usually means pressure from multiple directions at once. Public pressure, media pressure, internal family pressure, and sometimes fear. Now let's talk about the word everyone fixated on, but few discussed openly. Car crash. It appeared almost immediately in conversations around the statement, even though the palace itself was careful about how it acknowledged events. Why? Because information had already begun leaking before the statement. Whispers from reporters, social media posts that vanished, sources speaking in vague terms. The palace wasn't shaping the story from scratch. They were reacting to a narrative already forming. And that is a position the monarchy hates. Because once speculation starts running faster than official communication, control slips. Here's where things get even more interesting. The palace did not deny anything outright. No firm dismissal. No strong correction. No, reports are inaccurate language. Instead, they acknowledged concern and sadness. That's a subtle but powerful move. It doesn't confirm details, but it validates emotion. And when you validate emotion publicly, you're admitting that whatever happened crossed a threshold. So what threshold was crossed? That's the question that haunted the hours following the announcement. Was it the severity of the incident, the potential implications, or the emotional state of the people involved? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes institutions respond not to events themselves, but to how close those events come to reopening old wounds. And few families in the world carry wounds as publicly as this one. Which brings us to Meghan Markle. Her name, placed carefully within the announcement, carried weight beyond the immediate situation. Because Meghan's history with the palace is not neutral. Every word involving her is politically charged, emotionally loaded, and globally scrutinized. And yet, this statement avoided blame entirely. No distancing language. No passive deflection. No subtle reminder of separation. Instead, there was acknowledgement. That alone marked a shift. For years, communication around Meghan had been restrained, minimal, and often indirect. This time, there was no attempt to minimize her relevance. Which begs another question. Why now? Why acknowledge her so directly in a moment of sadness? One possibility is simple but profound. In moments of real crisis, narratives collapse. PR strategies weaken. Old grudges pause. Human concern overrides institutional posture. And that's what many felt reading between the lines. This wasn't about optics. This was about something that genuinely alarmed the people inside those walls. Now imagine the internal discussions that followed the incident but preceded the announcement. You have advisors asking, what if this leaks before we speak? You have legal teams asking, what can we safely say? You have family members asking, is she okay? And hovering over all of it is a single unspoken fear. What if this escalates? Because when a story involves health, safety, and unpredictability, The worst-case scenarios always sit at the table, even if no one names them. And that fear shapes language. It slows certainty. It softens tone. It introduces caution where confidence usually lives, which is exactly what we saw. The statement wasn't decisive. It was careful, almost fragile, and that fragility was felt by the public immediately. You could see it in the reaction. People who normally argue stopped arguing. Critics tempered their words. Supporters grew quiet instead of celebratory. This wasn't a moment for victory laps or outrage. It was a moment of collective pause, because everyone understood something instinctively. Whatever happened, it was close enough to danger to force reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable. Now here's a contradiction that didn't escape notice. While the palace spoke, details remained scarce. In an age of instant updates, that scarcity stood out. No timeline, no sequence of events, no confident reassurance, which means either they didn't yet have all the information, or they had information they weren't ready to share. Both possibilities are unsettling in different ways, and both suggest that what happened was more than a passing inconvenience. As the hours passed, journalists began circling the same question. Why does this feel heavier than it should? And the answer may lie not in what was said, but in what was avoided. There was no mention of routine, no framing as minor, no emphasis on normalcy. Instead, there was acknowledgement of sadness. Sadness implies loss, not necessarily of life, but of safety, peace, or illusion. Something was shaken, and once shaken, it can't simply be ignored. Which leads us to the next crucial piece. This announcement didn't exist in isolation. It followed a pattern of escalating pressure around Meghan's life, security, and public exposure. A pattern that, when combined with a sudden incident involving a car, created a perfect storm of concern. The palace wasn't just reacting to one moment. They were reacting to accumulation. And accumulation changes everything. Because when pressure builds long enough, even a single incident can become the breaking point. So ask yourself this. What if the announcement wasn't about the crash itself? What if it was about what the crash represented? A warning, a reminder, a moment where multiple risks converged at once. And if that's true, then the real story didn't begin with the statement. It began earlier, before the cameras, before the headlines, before anyone outside a small circle realized something was wrong. Because long before Kensington Palace spoke, there were signs. And when you understand those signs, the announcement stops feeling sudden. It starts feeling inevitable. But what happened before the palace broke its silence? The quiet build-up, the unseen tension, the moment that tipped the balance, is where this story truly turns. And once you see how close everything came, you'll understand why the palace acted when it did. But that part of the story begins before the announcement. It begins with pressure. And that pressure had been building for a long time. Pressure doesn't arrive all at once. That's the lie people believe. They imagine a single breaking moment, a dramatic collapse, a visible crack. But real pressure is quieter than that. It builds invisibly, layer by layer, comment by comment, headline by headline, until one ordinary moment suddenly isn't ordinary anymore. And by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. Here's a question that almost no one asks out loud. What does it actually cost to live under a microscope that never turns off? Not just for a week, not during a scandal, but for years. Because long before the palace announcement, long before the words car crash entered the conversation, Meghan Markle had been living inside a pressure chamber most people will never experience. And that matters more than you might think. Let's rewind. Not to the wedding, not to the interviews, not to the moments everyone already debates endlessly. Let's rewind to the quieter moments no one clips. The days where nothing dramatic happens, except the accumulation. A glance that becomes a headline. A silence that becomes suspicion. A facial expression analyzed like evidence in a trial. Imagine going to lunch knowing someone, somewhere, will decide what it means. Not what you said, not what you did, what it means. That's not criticism. That's interpretation as entertainment. And it never stops. Now here's the contradiction that makes this story uncomfortable. Meghan Markle was often described as strong, resilient, unbothered. But strength, when demanded constantly, becomes another kind of burden. Because when the world decides you're strong, it quietly revokes your right to struggle. People stop asking how you're holding up. They start assuming you'll handle it. that you always do. And that assumption becomes its own form of isolation. Let me ask you directly. How long could you carry the weight of millions of opinions without being allowed to put it down? Because for Meghan, there was no off switch. Leaving the royal family didn't end the scrutiny. If anything, it intensified it. Every move reframed as motive. Every project judged as strategy. Every absence questioned as avoidance. And here's the cruel irony. The more she tried to reclaim privacy, the more attention followed. That's not freedom. That's pursuit. This measured approach, however, did not prevent speculation from spiraling. Within hours, commentators and analysts were discussing worst-case scenarios, long-term implications, and what this might signify for Meghan's security, autonomy, and relationship with the institution. Conversations that would have seemed exaggerated in normal circumstances suddenly carried weight because of the layers of pressure surrounding her life. And then came the contradictions that truly amplified tension. Initial reports indicated that Meghan had been uninjured and that the vehicle sustained minimal damage. Yet later accounts introduced ambiguities, reports of brief hospital visits, conflicting witness statements, and subtle hints at procedural lapses. Even small discrepancies gained outsized significance in a story already charged with emotion and attention. These contradictions did more than confuse the public. They placed additional pressure on the palace and Meghan alike. Every correction, clarification, or delay in information release became a point of scrutiny. Every careful statement was dissected for meaning. Every pause was interpreted as a sign of something more serious. At the same time, Meghan's personal response remained largely unseen, yet it was central to understanding the unfolding crisis. Sources hinted at calm professionalism outwardly, juxtaposed with private exhaustion and emotional strain. Imagine the duality. Presenting composure publicly while managing intense internal pressure. Every word, every movement, every decision carried weight far beyond the ordinary, extending into both public perception and personal security. This is where the complexity deepens. The incident itself, minor or not, was only the trigger. What truly mattered were the conditions surrounding it. Relentless public attention, ongoing media scrutiny, institutional caution, and cumulative emotional fatigue. As hours passed, the palace faced an increasingly delicate challenge: how to maintain authority, protect privacy, and manage perception simultaneously. Any misstep could ignite a new wave of speculation, create legal complications, or strain relationships internally. The stakes were further complicated by a growing emotional shift in public perception. Early criticism and skepticism began to soften, replaced by concern and empathy. For many, the incident humanized Meghan in ways that years of media coverage had rarely achieved. This shift was subtle but significant. It signaled that even in highly polarized contexts, collective perception can pivot rapidly, and institutions must respond accordingly. And then, just as the narrative seemed to stabilize, new developments arrived. Hints of procedural gaps, questions about safety measures, and the potential for future vulnerabilities. What initially appeared as an isolated event suddenly suggested systemic issues. Patterns of oversight, security protocols, and communication strategies all came under scrutiny. This revelation introduced another layer of complexity. The palace, while experienced in managing crises, had to reassess long-standing protocols and decisions. For Meghan, every routine action, every movement, appointment, and interaction became a potential flashpoint. The pressure intensified not because the incident alone was severe, but because it exposed the delicate balance of safety, perception, and public scrutiny that she navigated daily. The story had evolved from a single car crash to a multidimensional crisis, one that intertwined personal vulnerability, institutional responsibility, media frenzy, and public emotion. Each element influenced the others, creating a feedback loop that heightened tension. And just when it seemed the situation might begin to settle, subtle signs indicated that this was far from over. Analysts noted patterns suggesting that the incident was connected to broader challenges: ongoing security assessments, scheduling conflicts, and strain on support systems. The implications extended beyond the immediate event, hinting at the fragility of the system surrounding Meghan and the palace. In crisis management, the smallest cracks often reveal the greatest vulnerabilities. A minor incident can expose systemic issues, test relationships, and highlight risks that had been tolerated or ignored. That is precisely what was occurring in this case. The incident, while initially appearing singular, had illuminated the pressures that had been building for months. It highlighted vulnerabilities, humanized the individual involved, and tested institutional capacity. It reminded everyone that even a brief moment of unpredictability could ripple outward, affecting perception, policy, and personal well-being. And as the story continued to unfold, one truth became increasingly clear. This was not merely a car crash. It was a revelation, a lens through which the interplay of human vulnerability, institutional responsibility, and public perception could be observed with unprecedented clarity. The question now shifted. How would the palace respond next? How would Meghan navigate this intricate web of scrutiny, expectation, and genuine concern? And what would the broader implications be for her life, autonomy, and ongoing relationship with the institution? The answers were still forming, and the hours ahead promised to reveal consequences no one had fully anticipated. The next phase of the story unfolded in the form of controlled statements, strategic pauses, and subtle messaging. The palace was acutely aware that every word, or the absence of words, would be dissected. Communication was no longer just about relaying facts. It was about managing perception, shaping narrative, and preventing speculation from spiraling out of control. Many hooks emerged in the form of tiny details, almost invisible to casual observers, but potent to those who understood the mechanics of royal communication. The careful phrasing in updates, the timing of releases, the omission of specific injury reports. All were calculated to create a balance between transparency and discretion. Analysts noted that the language of the statements avoided absolutes. There were no emphatic assurances, no categorical denials, no vivid depictions. Instead, the language was tempered, carefully chosen, emotionally measured. This conveyed concern without dramatization, an acknowledgement without overexposure. Every word was weighed against potential interpretations and consequences. Meanwhile, the media ecosystem churned. Analysts debated what the lack of detail implied. Headlines juxtaposed minor incident with palace concerned, creating cognitive dissonance for readers. Social media amplified every ambiguity, turning uncertainty into viral speculation. Each fragment of information, whether confirmed or speculative, became a thread in a rapidly expanding narrative web. This is the point where contradictions became central. Journalists reported minor variations in the sequence of events. Security sources suggested one set of protocols had been followed, others implied procedural gaps. Observers noted inconsistencies in timestamps, locations, and eyewitness accounts. The discrepancies fueled intrigue and tension, highlighting the challenges of communicating in real time under extreme scrutiny. For Meghan, the situation was not abstract. Every emerging report was a reminder of personal vulnerability under relentless observation. Routine actions became symbolic. Every errand, appointment, and interaction was interpreted through a lens of risk and speculation. Even a drive, normally mundane, transformed into a potential headline-generating event. The pressure extended beyond physical safety. Emotional strain compounded. Fatigue, hypervigilance, and constant scrutiny created an environment where stress accumulated almost imperceptibly, only becoming visible in moments like this incident. Those hours following the crash revealed the human cost of perpetual public attention. Public sentiment began to evolve. The initial wave of curiosity was now layered with empathy, concern, and speculation. Even long-standing critics began to acknowledge the reality of vulnerability. For many observers, the incident humanized Meghan in ways that years of media debate had not achieved. Subtle shifts in perception changed the emotional landscape surrounding her, altering how both the public and media engaged with the story. Simultaneously, the palace faced complex decisions. Timing, tone, and content of any further statements required careful deliberation. Any misstep could exacerbate public concern, invite legal challenges, or trigger additional media frenzy. Communication became a tightrope walk, balancing reassurance with discretion, transparency with strategic restraint. Emerging patterns suggested broader implications. Observers began connecting the incident to systemic pressures, ongoing security assessments, scheduling complexities, and operational constraints. What initially appeared to be an isolated event now pointed to vulnerabilities in institutional protocols and support systems. This elevated the stakes, indicating that the implications extended beyond the immediate incident. The narrative transformed from a singular event to a multi-layered crisis involving human vulnerability, institutional responsibility, media scrutiny, and public perception. Each element interacted, amplifying tension and creating a feedback loop where pressure and uncertainty intensified each other. Amid this, subtle indicators revealed the potential for systemic consequences. Patterns in scheduling, security practices, and communication protocols suggested that the incident was not entirely unpredictable. The story became a case study in how minor events can expose structural weaknesses, compel institutional recalibration, and force reassessment of standard procedures. At the center was Meghan. She was navigating a landscape defined by external pressures, internal responsibilities, and personal vulnerabilities. Her ability to manage composure, maintain safety, and address public perception simultaneously was tested at every turn. The incident highlighted the delicate interplay of personal agency, institutional oversight, and public scrutiny. The palace's response underscored the complexity of crisis management. By balancing acknowledgement with discretion, they aimed to preserve institutional credibility while managing the potential fallout. The statement of concern, carefully calibrated, served both as an acknowledgement of reality and a mechanism for controlling narrative trajectory. Yet, despite all efforts, uncertainty persisted. Conflicting reports, incomplete details, and evolving public perception ensured that speculation remained central to the unfolding story. The absence of definitive information became a catalyst for ongoing discourse, drawing attention and sustaining engagement. And just when the situation appeared to stabilize, subtle new signals emerged. Observers noted small discrepancies in security protocols, minor deviations in procedural norms, and hints of logistical pressures that could magnify risk if unaddressed. The system's fragility became increasingly apparent, emphasizing that the incident was a warning as much as an event. This realization reframed the narrative. The car crash was no longer merely an incident. It became a lens through which multiple intersecting pressures, personal, institutional, and societal, could be examined. It revealed vulnerabilities, tested responses, and highlighted the interplay of risk, perception, and emotional resilience. From this point forward, the story could no longer be viewed as an isolated moment. It had evolved into a sustained narrative involving cascading pressures, adaptive institutional strategies, and heightened public attention. Each subsequent development would be shaped by the tension exposed in these early hours, creating a chain reaction whose implications extended far beyond the immediate incident. And just as clarity seemed within reach, another unexpected factor entered the picture, setting the stage for further escalation. Details emerged suggesting that what had appeared to be a single event might actually intersect with broader operational concerns, underlying pressures, and prior vulnerabilities that had been quietly building. The result was a complex, multidimensional situation. The incident was both a trigger and a revelation, highlighting the delicate balance of safety, perception, and scrutiny in a highly visible life. And the hours that followed would determine not only how the immediate crisis was managed, but also how future vulnerabilities would be addressed. The story was far from over. In fact, the next developments promised to test every assumption, reveal hidden pressures, and challenge the very frameworks designed to manage risk. The following hours marked a tense evolution in the narrative. The palace's careful silence contrasted sharply with the chaotic swirl of media coverage, speculation, and social media commentary. While official statements remained measured, the surrounding ecosystem had grown volatile, each new interpretation layering additional pressure on both Meghan and the institution. Many hooks surfaced in the form of subtle shifts. A cryptic tweet from a royal correspondent, a delayed article clarifying minor details, an eyewitness account that contradicted prior reports. These small pieces were magnified by public interest, creating an environment where perception often outweighed fact. The story was no longer about a singular event. It was about the interplay between narrative control, human vulnerability, and institutional response. The palace's messaging strategy became increasingly complex. Every decision had to consider multiple audiences: the public, the media, staff, and family members. Timing was critical, tone was critical, accuracy was critical, and restraint, paradoxically, was as important as transparency. A single misstep could amplify confusion, undermine trust, or provoke emotional overreaction. Meanwhile, reports continued to diverge. Some sources described a minor collision, others hinted at a sudden evasive maneuver. A few mentioned brief medical evaluations. Others denied any injuries occurred. Even among eyewitnesses, accounts conflicted, reflecting the challenge of reporting in a high-stakes, fast-moving environment. Each fragment became a thread in a rapidly evolving narrative web, creating tension that persisted even as facts slowly coalesced. For Meghan, the psychological impact was significant. Every move, every word, every interaction became a potential headline. The compounded effect of constant surveillance, public scrutiny, and institutional oversight created a unique form of stress, one that was simultaneously external and internal, public and private. It is a rare phenomenon, the weight of expectation, responsibility, and visibility pressing on an individual in ways the general public can scarcely imagine. At the same time, public sentiment began to evolve. Initial curiosity gave way to empathy. Even those previously critical of Meghan began to temper judgment, acknowledging the human vulnerability exposed by the incident. The event had shifted perception, creating a subtle, yet significant, change in the emotional landscape surrounding her. Security considerations became central. Reports suggested that protocols had been followed in part, but may have had gaps. The incident prompted immediate reassessment of standard operating procedures. Vehicle routes, driver readiness, emergency communication protocols, and personnel allocation. Each adjustment was critical because even minor oversights in a high-profile environment can have disproportionate consequences. Simultaneously, the media narrative continued to evolve unpredictably. Analysts debated potential causes, speculated on implications, and connected the incident to broader institutional patterns. Headlines oscillated between reassurance and alarm, amplifying public attention. Social media intensified this effect, with every report, clarification, and contradiction circulated, discussed, and reinterpreted in real time. These dynamics highlighted a core reality. In environments of extreme visibility, incidents are rarely isolated. The car crash was not just a physical event. It was a lens revealing systemic pressures, vulnerabilities, and human responses. The collision of perception, reality, and institutional protocol created a multi-layered crisis, one that would demand nuanced management and continuous adaptation. Within the palace, deliberations were intense. Advisors weighed every potential statement, assessing legal implications, public reaction, and long-term consequences. Family members and staff navigated the tension between public obligation and private concern. Each decision involved trade-offs, with uncertainty amplifying every risk. Even small errors in messaging could cascade, producing unintended consequences. Meanwhile, Meghan's personal experience remained largely invisible but deeply consequential. Reports suggested composure outwardly, paired with inner fatigue and strain. The human dimension of the incident, the fear, the relief, the exhaustion, was largely hidden, yet it influenced both immediate reactions and long-term responses. The weight of constant observation made even minor incidents emotionally magnified. Public engagement demonstrated a notable pattern. While skepticism initially dominated, concern and empathy increasingly guided discourse. People paused to consider the human stakes, rather than focusing solely on narrative or controversy. This shift, while subtle, indicated that even highly polarized audiences could respond to authenticity, vulnerability, and perceived danger. And then subtle new developments emerged. Observers noted hints of procedural anomalies and minor deviations from protocol, suggesting systemic pressures that had been quietly building. These revelations indicated that the incident, while singular in occurrence, intersected with broader operational challenges, highlighting latent risks that required attention. The narrative was evolving from a single incident to a multidimensional crisis encompassing vulnerability, perception, institutional responsibility, and systemic adaptation. Each element influenced the others, creating a feedback loop that amplified tension and ensured ongoing attention. From this point forward, the story was no longer static. The incident had exposed fragility within a complex system, the intersection of human behavior, institutional oversight, public scrutiny, and operational logistics. Every subsequent development would be shaped by these factors, creating an evolving landscape where minor events could have disproportionate effects. And just when stability seemed possible, another element emerged. Reports surfaced hinting at connections between the crash and prior logistical strains, patterns that suggested the incident was not purely accidental but indicative of broader systemic pressures. These insights reframed the narrative, emphasizing that the car crash was both a catalyst and a mirror, revealing vulnerabilities in human, institutional, and operational spheres. The story had reached a critical juncture. What appeared at first to be a single, isolated event was now understood as a multi-layered, interconnected situation. Risk, perception, and vulnerability had collided, producing a scenario whose full implications were only beginning to be understood. And yet, despite the emerging clarity, uncertainty remained. Conflicting reports, incomplete details, and evolving public perception ensured that speculation would continue, keeping the narrative alive, dynamic, and unpredictable.